1940, 15-year-old Max Michelson witnessed the annexation of Latvia by the Soviet Union. In 1941, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union occurred. Max quickly lost his entire family and witnessed the brutalities of war and genocide, the Holocaust. 40-plus years ago, Framingham and Natick were considered the wilderness of the greater Boston Jewish community. In 1972, a survey in the community determined that there was a need for a Jewish family service. Max Michelson and Max's wife Julia were members of the survey committee. In fact, Max was the chair. The survey committee's recommendation was the following, quote, "The Board of Directors of the Jewish Community Federation set up a planning committee charged with exploring ways and means of establishing a Jewish family services in the greater Framingham area." That was 1972. In 1979, planning groups take a long time, Jewish Family Service was incorporated as a not-for-profit. Yehuda Lefton was the first president, and the giant sum of $14,000 was approved by the Jewish Federation of Framingham. The first clients were served in 1981. Julia Michelson was the third JFS president, and Max was the fourth. Max has lived a life of accomplishment and care, caring for family, caring for the Jewish community, caring for the broader community. And he's always stood up for those left behind, and has encouraged staff and board members to do likewise. I, along with so many others, admire Max, know Max as a mentor and friend, and feel honored that he's remained so involved with JFS. Max Michelson.
I hope you can all hear me. If you can't, let me know. Today I want to talk to you about not just starting JFS, but also my own background. And my experience during the Holocaust, which in some sense reflected on why we started JFS. Part of it was, of course, Julie was a social worker, and we came to this area, as he says, wilderness. Anyway, we were sitting between Worcester and Boston. There were Jewish family service in both places, but no service here. So after some various ins and outs, we thought we should start one, and the success was more than what we could have expected at the time. Anyway, let me start by a brief overview of my experiences during the Holocaust. And then I'll also touch on some specific topics on the emotional aspect of viewing the killings during the Holocaust, the role of community that I experienced during the Holocaust, and which has pushed me very much in terms of being involved in community, and also in starting family service here as a need, as something that we saw the community needed. And so I'll talk briefly also about survival and the element of chance in survival, and lessons learned. But really, at the end, I do want to focus more on the starting of JFS and the various reasons for doing that. But let me start first with my own experience. I was born and raised in Riga, Latvia. I was born in 1924. I'm 90 years old last year. And I was raised in a rather well-to-do middle-class family. I had one sister who died of meningitis in 1935, so at the time that we're talking about World War II, I was a single child. My parents had lived in Latvia for well over 200 years. We were sort of, in some sense, integrated in the community, and in the other sense, not. The Jewish families in Latvia were not well integrated with the Latvian native population. We had some non-Jewish friends, to be sure, but not very few Latvian friends, and that has something to do with the effect on the Jews during the Holocaust in Latvia. We were a German-speaking, assimilated family, and in 1940, as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact with Germany and Soviet Union, Latvia came to be under Soviet domination. Latvia, we were sitting really between the devil and the deep blue sea, with a frying pan, a fire in the frying pan, whichever simile you want to use. And we had this naive or illusion that we would be left alone. Here was the Soviet Union, here was Nazi Germany, and we just thought that life, it was good. I mean, there was some anti-Semitism to be sure, but you know, it was not the kind, murderous kind that appeared later. So it was fine, and we were living there hoping to be left alone. Well, we weren't going to be left alone. With the Soviet occupation in 1940, in the June of 1940, we were very rapidly kicked out of our factory. We lived in a villa next to a factory that my grandfather had started, my father and uncle ran, a plywood factory. And the factory was forthwith nationalized by the Soviets, and we were forthwith kicked out of our house, which was on the grounds of the factory. It became a reason for, you know, it was part of the factory. We were out. We moved into a small suburban apartment, and life under the Soviets was really not, it was difficult. But for me as a young boy, I was 15 at the time, it was sort of an exciting time. In the schools, we quickly learned to paraphrase the communist line, gave them back what they wanted to hear and so on, but they let us live anyway. Now, my father was out of work for a long time, for several months, until he found something in it. I don't even know what ministry, but he found. My wife, who had worked, my mother, who had worked as his secretary in the factory office, she ran actually an office manager in the factory. She was out of work and became a housewife, and her cooking was really quite good. we get into different details. I really don't want to get very bogged down in that. But on Sunday, June 22nd, 1941, Germany broke the non-aggression pact and attacked the Soviet Union. And at the time I was 16, I had just finished third year high school, somewhat equivalent to 11th grade high school here. And we decided not to escape to the Soviet Union. There were several reasons for that. For one, as bourgeois, we were not considered trustworthy, and the Soviets didn't want us and discouraged us from leaving. Apart from that, in the Stalin's purges, my mother's youngest brother had been executed as a German agent of all things. Well, you know. And the Red Army, it was clear that the Germans would occupy Riga. What was inconceivable, and that we would have a very difficult time under the Germans, was clear. That what we had heard with the reports, and so that was very clear. What was not clear was that the policy of the German state would be to kill all Jews, period. In fact, to us, this was sort of inconceivable. Germany, this was the 20th century. Germany was a cultural country in Europe, and so everything fine. It was inconceivable that all the Jews would be killed overnight. Anyway, the Red Army was in precipitous retreat. We had decided not to escape to the Soviet Union. That was a fateful decision, but so. on July 1, about 10 days, there was a sort of a 10-day interim period, very somewhat calm, nothing happening, but waiting for the terrible things to happen. And they sure enough did. Riga fell on July 1, and overnight civilized life for us Jews disintegrated. In fact, overnight we were no longer human. There erupted an orgy of terror, of murder, of atrocities, of humiliations. We were attacked on the streets. We were there. Mostly the men were dragged from apartments, and what we didn't know at the time, actually, they were taken to the nearby woods and shot. Typically, the people arrested were first taken to the police headquarters downtown Riga, and that was just sort of an example how civilized had gone. You know, what we saw, all the attacks were the local paramilitaries, former policemen, pre-Soviet time policemen, and so on. And they had and the Germans encouraged and orchestrated and encouraged the murders. But at the time, all we saw was the murders by the locals. And what we thought that this was a local pogrom, a local attack on the Jews, and not a overall policy. Well, a couple of months later, when the German civil administration took over from the army, it became clear that the attacks were continued. They were no longer done by the locals, now they were done by the SS and the Gestapo, the German Nazis, but nonetheless the attacks continued. Several atrocities, synagogues were burned down with the people locked inside, the rabbis locked inside. All synagogues in Riga were destroyed except the one in downtown Riga where we belong to, that remained to this day as a functioning synagogue. During the war, it was the eastern wall, the main wall was boarded up so that, and it was a stable or something like that, but the synagogue survived and survived pretty much. I had been bar mitzvah there in 1937, and after the war, when I visited Riga in 91, there was a synagogue just like before, and in fact I was called up to the Torah, so it was in some sense very nice, but of course difficult. Yeah. So these attacks now continued, and as I say, we believed it was a local excess, but it didn't turn out to be there. But the Germans and the Latvian Nazis perpetrated the myth that under the Soviets, the Jews had killed all the Latvians. There was a lot of attacks on Latvian men by the NKVD, and the NKVD had some Jews in it, but there were also Latvian communists, but that was disregarded. That was not important. The Jews did it. So that, and it was billed like a revenge against the Jews. We in the neighborhood, we had moved into a different neighborhood after being kicked out of the house, and we had been there for only a short time. And I think the reason in the first days of the occupation, when people came, when the Latvian Nazi police came and dragged Jews out of their apartments to be killed or whatever, we were spared for about a week. There was nothing there. And I believe that was probably due because we were new in this area. Then I had a summer job, started to work, and I got around with my bike sort of easily, and I went back to my job. I naively thought, oh, I'll get the job back after all the occupation, I'll get my summer job. But I pretty soon was told, don't bother, we don't need you. But nonetheless, I never stayed home. Every morning I took my bike and I was out. I don't quite remember what I did. I do remember one thing, that we were in a nice suburban neighborhood. We had a small apartment there, and I went into the nearby woods and was reading book or so, whatever. Anyway, I was not home. 10 days later, early July, I come home and my mother is not home. My father related that that the police again had come to get him to work, ostensibly to work. That was a euphemism, take you to work. Well, he was not too well. He was early 60s. My mother was 10 years younger. She offered to go in his place to work. Fine. Off she went. We never saw my mother again. I don't, to this day, don't rightly know whether she, like most of the men, were killed on that day. Or, so my father got some rumors somewhere that she was in prison. And there were a lot of Jewish women, 1,500 Jewish women were in prison. Whether she was released or not, I have no idea. And whether she was never released. Whether she was in prison or not, I really have no idea. I tried to make I had some opportunity for some contact, and they told me the answer, and this was several months later, in early 42 already, that she had been in prison but wasn't there anywhere. The implication was that she was killed. I know. She obviously was killed. So. The interesting part about it is that had I been home that day, I would also be gone, taken to work, quote unquote. What the other thing that I find interesting, at the time, that never dawned on me. That was too threatening a thought to think about. That is something that afterwards I began to appreciate, but not at the time. So, the Nazis have now declared open season on Jews. Jews could be killed at will by either the Nazis or the Latvians. There was no law or order or anything like that. We had hoped that the German civil administration would change that. There would be a harsh law and order, but at least some kind of law and order. That didn't happen. It was really not really optimism, it was naivete and denial. The denial that we had heard about the persecutions in Poland before, but the fact is that we really had not taken seriously enough. And in fact, now there started to be issued decrees specifically about the Jews, aimed at this deliberate degradation and dehumanization. There were petty humiliations too, clean toilets or streets with toothbrushes. I mean, and there was a gradual escalation, a relentless escalation of these humiliations of the decrees. Jews couldn't walk on sidewalks, couldn't use streetcars or trolley cars or buses, or rent taxis, or the horse-drawn carriages that were in Riga for rent. We were not permitted to go to the park, to the theater, to the museum, all that. Our ration coupons became half of the coupons for the general population, and then we weren't permitted to shop in the regular stores and so. And then finally we had to move into the ghetto. And I remember the ghetto was diagonally apart the city, maybe a mile or a mile and a half away, maybe a couple of miles away from where we lived. I know my father went several times by foot across it. He found a room in a small two rooms and kitchen apartment. We got the one room. We moved there with a minimum of our possessions, in August sometimes. We had the room. There was my father, myself, and my father's brother, who had been a bachelor, had lived separately in town. So the three of us moved into one apartment. And I have to tell you, during the years, the war years, every time we moved, the physical situation got worse. In the ghetto, we had, well, it was a very crowded place, very crowded. If your family had a room, it was already fine. In our place, it wasn't too bad. We had two little rooms. The other room was shared by a family with a girl. I knew her from school. And we had a tiny kitchen, which we used together. But every time we moved from one situation, the physical situation, the sanitary situation, and the crowding and the privacy got much worse. So, as I say, in this one apartment, we had one room, we had privacy. Well, the three men together, my mother wasn't with us anymore. It was, in retrospect, at the time, it was fine. It only got worse. We moved into the ghetto, and they started to build the barbed wire around the ghetto to eventually close us in. Although that didn't happen, we moved into August. We were not sealed in till almost 2 months later. By the end of October, 25 October, we were sealed in, and Jews were permitted into the city only with an escort, a Gentile escort. It didn't matter whether this was a child or an old man, old woman, or a young person, or a German soldier. It didn't matter. The idea was to show Jews are not human, and therefore cannot be relied to know where they're going, and have to be driven like cattle through the streets. That was, I think, the main idea. Also, of course, to some extent, limit the interaction between the Jews and their various acquaintances in the city, although that didn't really prevent us from doing that. There were ways in which you got around. We worked, and at the time we thought that we hoped work would offer some safety. After war we do useful work, and then we hoped that would be the key for survival. Not so. The Nazis and the Gestapo had the primary goal was to kill the Jews. A secondary goal was to win the war, but if it came one or the other, the Jews were the important thing to kill. Part of it was also a kind of a survival instinct of the Nazis. The SS and the Gestapo had dealt with the Jews in the background and not with the Russian army, with the Red Army at the Eastern Front, which was a much more dangerous operation for them. And they very often tried, so they made their work, the Jews, killing Jews was their job instead of going to the front. We our work was, some worked as artisans, there were tailors, shoemakers, many artisans who worked for the Nazis, in fact, mostly for the Nazi, for the German army, for the SS. There were some very elegant workshops with the pretense that the workers were not Jewish, so not to offend the high Nazi officials who came to get the elegant suits made, but anyway. We also worked, we did housework as janitors, or women did cleaning for the Nazi officers who took over the Jewish apartment and so. Anyway, pretty soon there started rumors that the ghetto would be closed and we would be resettled further east. Very vague rumors, resettled east to some other camps. The resettlement became again a euphemism for killing. But so it was a constant fear. I remember the constant anxiety. We didn't know what was going on, what was going to happen, and so on. And there were no answers, no suggestions. Maybe some people knew what was going to happen, but certainly it was not talked about and not told. Just anxiety. They also fenced off a corner, a two-block corner of the ghetto for presumably a men's work camp. And that sort of, again, added some more anxiety to the thing. The liquidation of the ghetto, the so-called the Great Action, started 5 weeks later. On the weekend, November 29 to December, Saturday, Sunday, 29th November, 30th November, the evacuation of the ghetto began. And it started with the western half of the ghetto. The ghetto was sort of a longish affair, and the western blocks were evacuated first. And as usual, I couldn't sit still, and an early Sunday morning we were in the eastern part of the ghetto, that's why I'm here, for that matter. I got out of our apartment. We were set back against a tight picket fence with a sort of small crack, in the gate. I could see the street that led to the rear exit. And I saw a column of Jews just turning into our street. It was the kind of a cold winter morning, not much snow, but sort of really dark morning still. And I saw this column of Jews walking with 5 abreast, total silence, with a lot of guards with bayonets on their rifles. And it made a terrible impression. There was something about watching them that there was a doom about it, I assumed at least, that they were going to be marched to a train station and taken further east into some other camp. In fact, they were marched 5 miles down the road, 6 miles down the road, to a pre-dug graves where they were sort of funneled into the graves, machine gunned right into the graves. On that first weekend, 13,000 people were killed, essentially half the ghetto. The ghetto had 32,000, and between the two weekend the killing, by the way, repeated the second weekend. But that first Sunday, the commander of the ghetto came back into the ghetto and said, "You can walk out, you're free to walk." And I almost literally took my father by the hand and dragged him into the men's ghetto, the men's work camp, because that seemed, and in fact it was, a safer place. Primarily, not that I thought the evacuation meant being killed, but because I preferred to stay in Riga. We had acquaintances, we knew the place, we spoke the language. I mean, it was really a preferable place to be than marched into the unknown. And my mother was not with us. For many men, there was a dilemma of whether to leave the women alone or not. For some of the men, there was no choice. They came back from work that day. They were pushed into that small work camp. And if the families lived in the other half, in the western half of the ghetto, they were gone. So that was, for us, that wasn't the issue. I think that my father was much more aware of what was going on. He had spoken before that when we are in the ghetto, when your mother, not if your mother, but when your mother is released into the ghetto, we need her warm winter clothing. We took that along into the big ghetto and so on. Now, there was no more talk about mother's winter clothing, and I think he was really much more depressed. I was much more see what looked safer. And afternoon, and this is sort of important, we found an apartment, speaking of physical thing, we found an apartment, a small, a one-room apartment, a tiny kitchen. You come into the kitchen, you come into the larger room in the back, and he had friends there, and so we joined them. There were about 10 people in that apartment now, all men, and at night we put mattresses on the floor side by side, and during the day the mattresses were picked up, and whatever clothes we had now, we hung on a nail. I mean, it was really much more. The sanitary condition you don't even talk about. This was a 8-apartment house, 2-story, 4 such apartments on each floor, and 2 toilets on each floor. 2 one-hole toilets. You can imagine what the place was like. But, you know, as I say, and the privacy, of course, was no longer. On the other hand, you know, later when we were in the camps, this was weekends we were alone. We didn't have a camp leader, a capo, so-called, on top of us. You know, everything was relative to the concentration camps that came later. There was still privacy. It was still, but it was pretty bad. Okay, that afternoon, after we found the place, I was milling around the entrance between the small, the work camp and the large ghetto to kind of find out what happened. And I ended up on a burial detail. During the evacuation, a lot of people actually were killed in the ghetto. At the time, you know, I tried to rationalize so you don't get killed, know what to do. And we rationalized that these are people found hiding, they were too old to walk, they were too young to walk, and so on. Anyway, there were a lot of people killed, and I ended up on the burial detail at the old Jewish cemetery. We were digging the graves, other people brought the dead to the cemetery, and what the startling memory for me was there was a young child, an infant, no trauma, no visible trauma, no blood. She was lying dead on one of the graves. And it sort of struck me at that point, it isn't what you do, it's you're going to get killed because you're a Jew. And this sort of really struck me. Before I tried to blame the victims, they had done something wrong. Well, the truth was just too terrible to face. Anyway, the second half of the ghetto was empty the following weekend, and repeated itself the same position. And so we were in this, we later called it the Little Ghetto. It really was a work camp. There were about 4,000 men, about 500 women. These were 500 seamstresses who were brought into the ghetto from the prison. My mother was not among them, so I don't, and at the time I don't know whether I inquired whether she had seen her. No, I don't think I did. In fact, the women and the men were separated, and it was not terribly easy. You could get in touch, but it was not totally easy. My father, as I say, I think was quite depressed. And found work in the ghetto. I went out to the ghetto into the city to work every day. And the day after the second action, the second killing, liquidation of the ghetto, took place on Sunday, Monday, December 7 and 8. And on the 9th, I came home at night. The ghetto was empty. My father was no longer there either. What had happened that this was the day after the liquidation of the large ghetto. They emptied out all the stragglers from the large ghetto, and everybody who had stayed in the small ghetto during the day were taken away and killed. And so at this point it was really quite clear that they had been taken to a different, by buses this time, not walked to a different forest nearby and killed there. So in fact, at that point I was alone. I hooked up, or rather, I was hooked up. A friend of the family who was somewhat older than I took me under his wing. We sort of shared resources, which really meant that his resources he shared with me. I mean, it was very nice and very appreciative. This was Victor Cohen. He was a son of friends and a son of the physician who had treated my grandmother. She had died before.
Max, excuse me, how old were you at this point?
At this point, 17. At this point, I was 17. So it became a kind of a mindless routine. I trudged to work every day, back, forth, hot, cold, and so on. But the routine was always interrupted by searches when we came back into the ghettos. Bread, money, anything was contraband, and people were caught or killed on the spot. In fact, my friend, Victor Cohen, was a very ethical person, and he said, stealing is stealing. You don't steal from the Germans any more than you steal from anyone else. And he thought to be able to manage the survival by, he had a non-Jewish, a Gentile sister-in-law, and I think he had some contacts, and he brought jewelry and stuff, mostly jewelry and watches, to sell, and brought back food into the ghetto. He sold, bought butter. He was caught one day, this was several months later, at the gate with bread and money, and hung on the spot. And which taught me at the time, and that was a wrong lesson for me anyway, that stealing is all right as long as you don't get caught. In fact, just as a sort of aside, I had to unlearn, when I got back into civilized society, I had to unlearn all the rules of the ghetto. The rules of the ghetto were not the rules that you can live in civilized society. But it was, in fact, for me personally, a very painful lesson. And I stole, not because I needed it, because it was there. You know, if food was there, you stole it. It had nothing to do, I wasn't going to sell it, I wasn't going to need it, eat it, steal it. It was painful. That was part of my painful reintroduction to civilized society. All right, to make a long story short, I had several jobs at this point, and eventually I settled in as a car mechanic in a German army maintenance, truck maintenance depot. And that was, again, you know, the circumstances of survival. I was listed as a car mechanic. My mechanical expertise was I could change truck tires. But I was listed as a car mechanic, and many times later I ended up as a factory worker in an ammunition factory. And that, again, this was preferable because it was an indoor job. This was already in Germany. We went back to Germany. An indoor job, 12 hours a day and night, alternating starvation diets. But as things go, it was not the worst kind of job that you could have. It was not outdoors in all weather in a mine breaking stones, you know, which was also some jobs. Anyway, so the ghetto, I stayed about 2 years in this little ghetto. Eventually we worked in a barrack. the job with the army truck depot brought us to settle outside the ghetto in a most of the stuff was arranged by bribes by people who had more. I was one of the working bees, but there were people who managed to have some money and managed to bribe, so that, for example, the job with this German truck maintenance depot was a fairly good job. We didn't do much and so on. We stayed out of the ghetto, saved the daily coming through the possible searches and so, and managed there they built a kind of a barracks and an abandoned old garage, and the men were separated, a small number of women were still there and so on. But it was under terrible circumstances, is the best that could be accomplished, kind of thing. We stayed for 2 months. Now, as it was clear that Germany was losing the war to everyone, but the question was when and whether we would survive to see the Allied victory. That was the big question. And so the ghetto was closed in '43. There were some uprisings. In our ghetto, there had been potential uprisings that sort of fizzled for various reasons. Again, this is too much to go into this, trying to get there. And we ended up in as the Red Army approached Riga, we were brought, our barracks were closed, and we went into a concentration camp in Riga, and then evacuated to a very large concentration camp in Germany, and then to a satellite camp of Buchenwald, a satellite work camp of Buchenwald, where we worked in the ammunition factory. I'm sorry, it's getting a little bit incoherent, but you'll have to bear with me. Anyway, I ended up in Magdeburg-Polter. The idea, the Germans had the idea to destruction through work was the plan. Hard work and no food, essentially a liquid soup and a liquid water and a third of a loaf of bread a day. That was enough to kill you. It was supposed to kill you in 9 months, and as luck would have it, the war ended before I was dead, but I pretty much got dead. Okay. I was in this camp in the spring of, work had essentially ended in the factory because power was lost. The factory was never bombed. Interestingly enough, Magdeburg was totally destroyed. The factory itself was not bombed, and our barracks next to the factory was not bombed. But one day, as the U.S. 7th Army attacked Magdeburg, our guards ran away, and we woke up in the morning, the gate was unguarded, so many of us just walked into the city. I was with a group of 4, we walked into the city, hid into a bombed out building, in the basement of the bombed out building. You cross over the rubble and get down, and very nice. In the euphoria, this was the 13th of April, I think, of '45, or so, about a month before the war ended. And in the euphoria, we thought we were already liberated. We had been the striped pajamas, we found some civilian clothing in the basement, and put that over the thing for warmth, and it was fine. Anyway, in the euphoria, it was cold that night. The town, Magdeburg didn't fall to the U.S. Army. The army went south of Magdeburg, didn't fall till a week later. That night was cold, so we made a fire in this bombed out building. And of course the smoke comes out of the chop, and the next morning we were caught again. Again, as luck would have it, we were caught by a militia, not the SS, and we claimed to be foreign workers. And they took us to the river Elbe, and you report on the other side. We said, yes, sir. We were on the, halfway across, there was an abandoned villa, so we hid in the garage. We ended up on the east side of the river. The Americans came to the west side and stopped and waited for the Red Army to come. And that took 4 weeks. In 4 weeks, we were sitting in the garage. I don't know. It was not good. By that time, I was more dead than alive. We eventually were liberated. The short story is that I was liberated by the Red Army. And after 3 months in the hospital, my friends who were much well off, I was really quite sick. My friends were well off. They went back to Riga immediately. I stayed in Red Army hospitals and in Soviet civilian hospitals, and eventually decided that I really have a claim to have TB, and because I wanted to go into a sanatorium, I thought food would be better. I ended up in the sanatorium, and 2 weeks later they kicked me out. I had managed to rub up the thermometer. Worked very well. I got there, but it didn't last. Anyway, so when it came, and now I found myself in a camp with all Latvian civilians who had escaped from the Soviet Union. And I had the vision that all of us would be directly into the Gulag. So I managed to escape from them, took a train to Berlin, found various adventures, but eventually ended up in a Jewish committee, got a claim to be a German Jew, got transported to the United Nations to West Berlin, to Western Zone, to the American zone of occupation, and made contact with my uncle. And in 1947, I came to the United States.
You had an uncle here now?
What?
You had an uncle in the United States?
Yes, he had escaped from Paris. Okay, let me talk a little bit more. So much for my experience. One of the reasons for survival was that it was community. I was very lucky in all the years in the camps, the 4 years in the camps. I was always with a group of people from Riga. People who had known the family. Some people I had known personally, but also people who had known the family. And that was a community. And as a community, you know, I always knew who I was, no matter what the Nazis say, you're not human. I knew I was human, you were not human. You were the monsters. So it was also a communal tragedy. Sure, I had lost family. I was, in fact, at the end, the only survivor. There had been 4 cousins, an uncle and 3 cousins, who had survived to the very end. In fact, one other cousin, one of these cousins survived for liberation, but died 2 months later of TB. So I was the only survivor, but it was always a community, and that was the tragedy was not directly an individual. Yeah, sure, I had lost all my family, but the tragedy, we had lost the entire community, and that was a communal tragedy, and as such made the individual, at least for me, it made the individual tragedy less painful. It was all of us, we had lost, not I had lost, and that made some difference. It was also a very close-knit Jewish community that we were all together. We were all from Riga, extended friends, family, acquaintances, and so that made a big difference. And as such, when we came to the States, in particular when we came to New York. I finished college in New York. Met my wife and married in New York. But then we came here. It was we moved into Framingham, and Framingham had an old Jewish community, a small old Jewish community. And we really had not too much contact, but we were a lot of people from somewhere else, and it didn't have a Jewish organizations here, and to get social work services from New York or from Boston, they wanted us to pay for the hours that they drove. It was not a good scene. So we decided to organize, and we started, Julie is a social worker, and I as an organizer. It was quite clear that it was going to be a non-sectarian Jewish family service. But service we got, we sort of managed to get that going, and that was, I think, quite important for us, and it has over the years really served as a center of the community. Before we had the Jewish Federation in Framingham, and that didn't really get off the ground, partly. And Boston was sort of the center, and we did not really get enough money going. We got 14,000 from them. I was involved with them too before that. So that was the. In terms of the survival, there was always. I had always an optimistic outlook. And my feeling is that life must be dealt with. You know, you live with what you get. Life is you haven't got a choice in it. But what you get, you have to make the most of it. And my feeling is that you have to live. I at least feel that I have to live actively and. Participate in the community. For me, my best way of honoring my parents and the lost community is to be active and work in the community. All right, that's, and one more thing before we go. If I talk at schools, and I know this is not the school, but I always end with lessons learned. And I find very much that the life must be respected, and particularly the dignity of all people. We may not like them, we may not have anything to do with them, but we must respect their dignity as people. They're people, they are not non-persons as we were described. That is kind of important. And the important part also is how we treat each other. That is and particularly how we treat those that are different from us. The ones that are like us, we generally treat quite well. The ones who are different from us, that is the measure of how a decent treatment that has to be. Fight prejudice, participate into various Holocaust memorial programs, particularly Facing History in Ourselves, which is a teaching program. I do a lot of speaking. But the important part also to know, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. You don't care about the other. That is the opposite, and that is what has to be, one has to do with. Okay. Questions? This is the short version. The long version, I'll be here for a week.
Take a deep breath, we'll do Q&A. Now, 3 of you have a little card underneath your seat that says Max. If you have the card, you're going to get a volume. Max is also quite an accomplished author, and you'll get an autographed copy of his book. It's underneath your seat. It is attached by tape underneath your seat. So, do we have any winners?
Oh, I think I have.
There's a 1.
Oh, I got one.
There's a two, and who has the third?
I think nobody.
There's a, no, it's not one of these. There's another one back here somewhere. But, what, no, it's not, I think it's
Mine says Staples.
So, a few minutes of Q&A.
I got it. If I can get it. You have to trust me.
Questions, reactions, you have maps if you want to have some. Who wants to start? Don?
No question?
Hey, Matt, just listening, I guess the one thing that struck me,
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
I'm sorry, and one thing that struck me as you were sharing your story, in your experiences, in terms of the Germans that you would have come in contact with during this, were there, I mean, were there people among them that would do things to help? It just seems so dismal that it would seem to me that a number of them would be victims as well of this.
The question is, did we meet people who were, among the Germans in particular, who were sympathetic, who tried to help us? So, very few. You have to remember that too was a dangerous game, even for the Germans. They get shipped to the Eastern Front. But I have an interesting anecdote. One of the, this was in the Little Ghetto, when we were in the Little Ghetto, yeah. No, there was still the line, before the liquidation of the big ghetto. A group of Jews worked for an Air Force outfit, cleaning, whatever. And one day, the commander of the outfit, who never had been seen, came storming in, shouting, "You filthy Jews, the place is run down, you haven't cleaned it, you have to clean it, you're gonna stay here all night and clean the thing." The interesting part was, that was the night that the first liquidation of the large ghetto came. And clearly, his way of protecting his Jews was to put on this magnificent shouting match of anti-Semitism. But that was almost say the only way that, even if they wanted to, they had to do it. He felt that's the way he could do it. Otherwise, very few. I have the other story. In Magdeburg, at the ammunition factory, I worked with a master one-on-one on an extrusion press. We worked maybe 3-4 months together, 12 hours a day, 12 hours a night, alternating week to week. Never over this time did he have any personal contact with me. I have no quarrel that he was not vicious, at least not overtly. He didn't beat me. I made some mistakes. Occasionally he may have shouted at me, but it was all right. Never any contact. And it kind of blows my mind, because even many of the SS people, they weren't friendly, but they had some curiosity. Where are you from? What are you? Wow, wow, wow. But I don't know. Anyway, does that answer your question? Any other questions?
Actually, you said you were in third year of high school. Was it a secular high school or was it a Jewish high school? Like your classmates, were they?
In my 10 years of schooling, 11 years, 10 years of schooling, I had 4 different languages of instruction. I started a German school, then the local fascists said you either go to your own ethnic school or to a Latvian school. I went to a Latvian elementary school, I went to a Jewish high school, and then the Jewish high school became a Russian high school, and under the Russian. So variously. Yeah. Interestingly enough, as a result, I had 4 languages of instruction. I know none of them well. Yeah, you know, I speak Russian, I speak German and Latvian I spoke very well. Russian and Hebrew I didn't. I know, but it's not, I'm not fluent.
When you speak at schools,
Yes.
what captures the minds of the children? I mean, can they understand the
I can
enormity?
only tell you what the teachers say to me. You talk for an hour and a half and the kids are quiet. And then we can't talk for 45 minutes and the kids are, no, most of them understand very well. And I do more of one, obviously more than what I do here, but
This may be a naive question. How were most people identified as being Jewish?
I'm sorry.
How were most people identified as being Jewish? I mean, if the name wasn't, you know, distinctly Jewish.
In Latvia, that really was not an issue. People by last name,
Yeah.
by not being Latvian.
Mhm.
There were a few sort of that passed occasionally, and very often were denounced by their neighbors.
Oh, my God.
Oh, yeah, yeah. That was one, in Latvia, that was a danger. You know, the Nazi behavior was different in Eastern Europe or in Western Europe. In Latvia, if they caught Jews hiding, by Latvians hiding, they killed both the Jews and the Latvians on the spot. In the Holland, they sent them to Auschwitz. I mean, the result was not much different, but the mode of treatment was quite different. You had a question?
Max, later in life, we will be able to reconnect with your cousins and uncles who survived the Holocaust?
Oh, yeah. My answer to that was at the time, maybe it's somewhat different, but if the people were alive, you met them. If you wanted to meet them, you met them. That was not the problem. The problem was the people you didn't meet were the ones that didn't survive.
I have a question. You had said initially when you went to the ghetto, your uncle was with you.
Yeah.
And then I lost track of
Again,
that.
I omitted this story.
Yeah.
My uncle was a bachelor who had been very active in labor affairs and was very well regarded by the workers in the factory. I do not know, but he was arrested a week before the liquidation. It was by the Latvian Nazi Party. I do not know why or what. He was released and rearrested before the liquidation. That was that. So he was no longer with us. We moved in the ghetto, we lived with him, but by the time the ghetto liquidation started, he was no longer with us. In fact, I don't know. There are some other interesting questions about it. I really don't know about it.
Were you lucky enough to get all the jobs that you did, or did they pick you? How do you moved in and out of jobs a lot?
How did I get the job that I got? Some of it was connections.
Okay.
If you knew the leader of that particular work column, you could get with him. Sometimes it was being picked at random. Those were not the good jobs. One of the lousy jobs were digging peat in peat bogs. There were a lot of lousy jobs. But you had, in Riga, you had a modicum of control. Not really, not always, but there was some modicum. In the camps, once you got concentration camps, that was almost not at all.
Well, I would think you were a young boy, they'd want someone strong, they'd want someone that could laugh.
Yeah. And we thought that was a ticket for survival. It really wasn't. I have a list this long of all the events that were a chance survival and not survival. Being at the wrong place, being at the right place, you know.
Interesting.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.